Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for your patience and joining us tonight for a legislative debrief voting rights edition. My name is Antonio Hernandez. I am the Civic Engagement Coordinator at Conservation Voters for Idaho, and my pronouns are he, him, el. I'd love for our panelists and my partner here today, Zephy, to introduce themselves. So I'm going to pass it off to Zephy.
Hi everyone, my name is Zephy Mireles and I am the voter rights intern for the ACLU of Idaho, and I will pass it on to Lauren.
Thanks, Zephy. Hi everyone, my name is Lauren Bramwell. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm the policy strategist with the ACLU of Idaho. And I'm so thrilled to be joining y'all to be talking about voting rights here in Idaho. I'll pass it over to Holly.
Hello, everyone. My name is Holly Condi. I am the legislative coordinator at Conservation Voters for Idaho, and I use she, her pronouns. With that, I will pass it back to Antonio.
Thanks, Holly. So let me just make sure we're all set up because, of course, technology keeps us sometimes from getting everything right. But for a reminder, this legislative session, we saw a lot of bills coming through the House and the Senate aiming to restrict our voting rights. And so we wanted to have a conversation today with these panelists about what those bills were and the implications of them. But before we go into that doom and gloom and also, the wins around what happened, I wanted to go around one more time and ask our panelists, if anything, what gave you hope this legislative session? And I'll pass it off to Lauren.
Oh, starting with me. What gave me hope this legislative session? I think that the power of community gave me hope this legislative session. I think a lot of times it can be, day after day at the State House can be daunting. It can be frustrating, but tuning into those committee hearings and seeing folks testify and speak truth to power and, come out really in numbers to oppose some of these really terrible pieces of legislation was really powerful to see and to witness. And so I think for me, it's really just applauding the power and strength and resilience of community during the 2022 legislative session.
And Holly, same question to you. What gave you hope this legislative session?
Along the same line, seeing folks show up and testify and watching that testimony have impact, right? Seeing, as opposed to last year when everything was virtual and it didn't have the same kind of impact, but being in a committee hearing and having somebody testify and watching lawmakers' faces react to it, right? And then you could see the wheels turning and you could see them actually responding to that testimony and then taking notes about it and weighing the pros and cons right in front of you. That was definitely gave me some hope. And then just having community show up, people in the hallways, the energy that people would bring into the building was uplifting for sure.
And Zephy, I'm not sure if you'd be willing to share. I know that this may be a bit of a newer space, but wondering if you have any thoughts on what gave you hope for your experience this time around.
I think for me, what gave me hope was just going back to the idea of community, but just watching the impact of how information and just knowledge will quickly spread amongst community, and just how quickly everyone's willing to respond and come together and just be able to be part of that and being part of being in that process of giving their information and relaying it to community, and just seeing how community came together by themselves. And sometimes without the help of organizations, they just knew that there was something going on and they saw the restrictions that were happening and they themselves did it. So I think for me, that's what really gave me hope.
Awesome. I want to echo everything that everyone said. That definitely gave me hope as well. I think the only thing I could add is that we saw also some election officials and personnel come out to speak on the impact these bills would have, and just to see that part, right? Like very it's not common for me to see county clerks come out in to talk about defending our democracy here in Idaho. And so that just signaled to me, one, how serious this was, this effort, some of these bills that we saw from certain legislators, and then also, right, how passionate these folks who work our elections are about maintaining integrity there. And so with that, Zephy, would you like to lead us into our first question for our panelists?
So the first question I have for both Lauren and Holly is, how does Idaho lead when it comes to making our elections accessible and secure? Holly, would you like to start us off? Sorry.
Yeah, I'll start us off on that one. So there's a few different things that Idaho does that really set us apart from other states, and set us apart so much so that we're not subject to federal oversight of our elections. So we have same-day voter registration. So you can go in, register to vote, no questions asked as long as you have the documentation. We have no excuse absentee voting, early absentee voting, online voter registration, ballot drop boxes. And then another thing that we have is that, you know, each county has its own clerk. And so Idaho is a very diverse state, you know, geographically and in other ways. And so each county gets to kind of decide what tools work best for it. And that, you know, most of the time that works pretty well. Sometimes it doesn't, but that can be a plus too. And then Lauren, if you have anything to add, go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, sure. I think absolutely. Holly really hit on the ways that voting access is really great here in Idaho. I think in terms of election security, you know, we know that allegations have been made across the country and right here in Idaho about the integrity of the election process, especially when it comes to the 2020 presidential election. And, you know, the Idaho Secretary of State's office, they took those allegations seriously. They held a recount in a few of Idaho's counties, and those findings showed that the vote totals were accurate. Oh my gosh, I love it when a cat appears on the screen. Hello, kitty. And so all that being said, I think I just want to really highlight that, you know, extensive research shows that fraud is very rare, that voter impersonation is virtually non-existent. I also really want to highlight, you know, the Brennan Center did an incredible report called The Truth About Voter Fraud. And that report reviewed elections that had been meticulously studied for voter fraud. And they found that incidence rates were between 0.0003% and 0.0025%. And so the report concluded that an American is more likely to be struck by lightning than to be impersonated by another voter at the polls. And so I think that really sums up nicely that, yes, Idaho is, their election process is secure. It is accessible, and we want to keep it that way.
Thank you both so much. And I want to remind anyone watching that if you have any questions, please feel free to add them. Post a comment. We'll be monitoring those throughout this live streaming event. And so this also just kind of brings up something that, right, like from my experience, I had the privilege and luxury of registering to vote when I first turned 18, fresh out of high school, right? And I think it was one, possible because I was able to do it same day. Right after I graduated in May, right? I thought about it, but of course I waited until November election day when I actually showed up, and luckily I had everything I needed for it. But so I just needed a photo ID, something that confirmed my address, and I was able to register and vote that same day. And that was really special, right? It's something I've kept with me all these years now, many years later. But thank you both so much for sharing that. I want to ask this next question about a particular bill, H692. So this bill would have overhauled elections in Idaho. And both of you, of course, working on the State House, working during this legislative session at the State House. Could you tell us how this bill, H692, would have impacted voters and if it would have made voting too difficult for Idahoans? And I'll start with Lauren.
Sure, there's a lot in that bill. So Holly, pay close attention to catch all the things that I missed. 692, all right. So 692, under current law, a new voter may register at the polls by signing an affidavit after providing proof of residency, as Antonio was mentioning. But this proposal would require proof of citizenship at the poll to register the same day as the election. The bill would also have prohibited the use of student IDs as a valid form of identification. I'm going to pass it over to you, Holly, to chat about other aspects of the bill.
692, I think it's worth pointing out that this bill had several iterations, right? It was originally proposed and then shot down, and then proposed and shot down and proposed and shot down, I think 4 different times. It was a complete overhaul of our entire elections code. So it went through and there were changes in every single section. And there were technical errors. There were issues where residents, literally thousands of Idahoans would have been cut out of the voting process. Young people in particular, so anybody who was maybe living with a parent and wouldn't have, a utility bill in their own name, or, like a cell phone record wouldn't be an acceptable form of proving your residency. It requires proof of citizenship. So people would have had to, bring their birth certificates to have poll workers look at these documents. It was just a massive overhaul of the entire code. And I think it's also important to note that this bill, along with every piece of legislation proposed by the House this year, had an emergency clause attached to it. And that means that it would have gone into effect immediately upon signing. And so that would have made, it would have been a huge overhaul of our elections process immediately before, like with only weeks to go before the primary election. I mean, we're talking like 8 weeks, 10 weeks maybe, and that would have required, the retraining of volunteer poll workers and all of this information to change the elections. The emergency clause was a big deal in all of this. So just a bad bill all over in every way, shape, and form.
And
in every version.
Yes. I mean, well, in the first iteration, right? The first iteration did away with same-day voter registration, which has tremendous implications, and it wasn't abundantly clear from that presentation that that's what the bill would in fact have done. And so I know that really was, cause for some public outcry. I also really appreciated, Antonio mentioned earlier, seeing, county clerks coming out in opposition to some of these bills. And, Holly, as you mentioned, some of like the technical oversights. One I remember really clearly was Kootenai County elections manager who came and said, that this bill contains flaws that is cause for concern. And one aspect was that there was a provision in the bill requiring clerks to mail registration documents only to a voter's residence. But that could be a huge problem because there are Idahoans who don't get mail at their residence and they use a post office. And so the example was in Spirit Lake. Most voters don't get mail at their residence. And so if those voter registration forms are returned to the county as undeliverable, then all those registrations would have been canceled, which has huge implications. And so again, just really highlighting the power of community, the power of county clerks that came out to really address all the concerns that were laced throughout that piece of legislation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So I do have a follow-up because I think about what you just shared, and back to my experience registering to vote for the first time. I positive I used a my high school ID to show, right, that I am a resident, and also as proof of a photo of who I am. And so this would have impacted, folks like me who were students, just graduated, had that as their ID. Who do you think, which groups would be most impacted by this overhaul bill? And I know you mentioned a lot of different pieces, but I am curious what you think. And I'll pass it to Holly this time.
Younger voters for sure. So those people who, are just turned 18, especially now, in this pandemic world where a lot of younger people are living with their parents, or they're living with their grandparents, they're living at home. They don't necessarily have those documentation, the documents that prove residence, right? That say, like, I live here, I pay a bill at this residence. This bill got rid of student IDs. So Antonio, you wouldn't have been able to use your student ID to register to vote. Military IDs wouldn't be an acceptable form of identification anymore. So definitely young folks, and also rural people, anybody with a PO box, which is huge numbers of people all over the state. People use post office boxes. They're super common. So yeah, big implications for many groups of people.
Lauren, would you like to add anything to that?
I think, just going back to the underlying documents that would be needed to prove citizenship, those underlying documents cost money, and it comes at a significant expense for lower income folks. And so, the combined cost of document fees, travel expenses, and waiting time is estimated to range anywhere from $75 to $175. And all that's compounded, of course, and serves as a major burden for people with disabilities, for elderly, people in rural areas who don't have access to public transportation. And so, all the burdens in getting the documentation necessary in order to exercise their right to vote.
And I will point out, this bill, along with similar ones, did have a provision to provide ID cards, right, at a cost to the state, but there's no infrastructure in the agency for that. Like, the agency hadn't been consulted. There was no system set up for how folks were going to get these ID cards. And it wouldn't have proved citizenship. They still would have had to get all their, citizenship documentation together. It was a mess. Yeah. And then also another group is elderly folks, folks who have been voting. They've got a system down, right? Like, they voted a certain way for decades in Idaho, and now they have to bring their birth certificate also after they've been voting at the same polling location for 20 years. So they would have been impacted as well. So longtime voters.
Thank you. I think we're ready to move on to our next question. Zephy?
The next question we have for you both is, there was a bill in terms of ballot collection, H4 547. We saw a bill that would make it a felony to carry mail-in ballots to drop-off locations for friends, neighbors, and family members. This bill was known as H 547. Do you believe that making a felony to carry ballots and making voting more secure, why or why not? Also, I would be interested to know, does this, similar to what Antonio asked earlier about who does this impact more, who would this impact heavily towards? And I will start this off with, I'll pass it on to Holly to begin with.
Ballot collection and, anti-ballot collection legislation is something that we have seen before and that other states have seen before. We saw a similar bill proposed by the same representative last year that also failed. It's based on, this legislation comes from a report, that the Carter Baker report, which is almost 20 years old. Our voter practices and our processes are very different than they were 20 years ago. And it's based on fears about so-called like ballot harvesting, which is not a thing in Idaho and has never been a problem in Idaho. And actually hasn't been a problem anywhere outside of one documented case that I've heard of. Right. And so it's not an issue, right? And it really impacts several different communities. So folks who live in rural places are impacted by this, right? If you've got a rural community and your neighbor is, say, elderly or homebound for any reason, you might do them a favor and take their ballot, their voted ballot. It's sealed. You might take that into town for them and drop that off in the mailbox or the ballot drop box. So anybody who has mobility issues, who is homebound, elderly folks, not everyone has a family member nearby, and to criminalize helping your neighbor is a big deal. I would also like to point out that there was a version of this that went through the Senate also, that started in the Senate, that also died in committee. So that was another win. And then I had another point about it, but I've forgotten for the moment. So Lauren, why don't you chime in?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's interesting because, our read of this legislation is it isn't even just criminalizing ballot collection, it's just criminalizing ballot assistance. And so, there aren't even exceptions for folks who may have, guardians, caretakers that may be offering assistance in filling out their ballot or dropping off their ballot. And that would criminalize those folks, that those exceptions weren't included in the bill. And I think the other thing that's really interesting is, this ballot collection bill, supporters of the bill really, evoked appeals to election integrity. And they reference instances of ballot tampering and ballot fraud as a reason why we need to criminalize ballot assistance. But Idaho already has laws on the books to address those concerns. We have so many, I have them listed here. We have so many, 1, 2, 3, 4, provides that every person not entitled to vote who fraudulently attempts to vote or attempts to vote more than once in an election is guilty of a misdemeanor. Any person who by force, threats, or corrupt means attempts to influence someone in giving their vote is guilty of a misdemeanor. Anyone who procures illegal votes, guilty of a misdemeanor. And so we have criminal codes in place that are already providing criminal penalty in instances of ballot tampering and ballot fraud. And so here, I think, as was mentioned by Holly, this is really a bill that was criminalizing Good Samaritans, would criminalize folks that are helping out their neighbor. And to your questions, Effie, too, on who really suffers from this piece of legislation. I think it leaves any Idahoans who may need assistance but live alone and don't have family members nearby particularly disadvantaged in exercising their right to vote. I would also say that bills that criminalize ballot collection disproportionately impacts Indigenous communities. Many Indigenous communities face less reliable mail service on remote tribal lands and often must travel long distances to reach a polling place or a post office to return a mail-in ballot. And so, a similar bill that criminalized ballot assistance was passed in Montana, and the ACLU of Idaho, in partnership with a variety of tribes, sued. And I think I am grateful that this legislation did not move forward, noting that it would have a real impact on all Idahoans' ability to exercise their right to vote.
Thank you both. A follow-up question that I have now, just as listening to both of you, I was wondering, where do you think some of this fear of voter fraud comes from in terms of the need for the ballot collection bill? Any one of you can start.
I think Lauren touched on it a little bit at the beginning of our discussion, but a lot of this has been amped up since the 2020 election and the so-called big lie, right? And that definitely stoked fears around who can vote and if voting is safe and if it's secure. And that has prompted a closer look at our elections, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but attacking our clerks and our systems that work and, you know, the impacts voters is absolutely a bad thing. So that's where most of what I've seen has come from, directly from the 2020 election and some of the rhetoric around that.
I don't think I have anything to add. Holly got it covered.
Thank you. I think we're ready to move on to the next question, Antonio.
Thanks so much, Zephy. And this is in a similar vein, right? We saw restrictions on multiple fronts, and this bill that I'm about to ask about is no different. This has to do with ballot drop boxes, which is Bill H693. So this bill would remove ballot drop-off boxes to make voting more secure. Do you believe that removing these ballot drop-off boxes would accomplish that goal? And why or why not? And I'll start with Lauren.
Thanks, Antonio. So Giddings, the bill sponsor, she said that she wasn't aware of security concerns or fraud that arises from the use of absentee ballot drop boxes in Idaho. So I think I can lead with that and saying I do not think that this piece of legislation is going to, make Idaho elections more secure. It is a bill that I think is a solution in search of a problem. I think ballot drop boxes, they minimize the number of people that need to access voting locations and provide more space for those who are engaging in in-person voting. They can be a real benefit for our polling locations to alleviate some of the overcrowding. I think too that some voters, they prefer to deliver their mail ballots to a drop box rather than sending them through the mail. And those voters may be motivated by lack of trust in postal processes, fear that their ballot could be tampered with, or concern that their signature will be exposed. And so, other folks may just be concerned about meeting the postmark deadline, and they want to make sure, they want to put the ballot in the drop box and make sure that their vote is counted. And so another piece of legislation that I am glad did not move forward. What do you have to add, Holly?
Yeah, just the bill sponsor said that there have been 0 cases of tampering. These ballot drop boxes are very secure. I've used them many times myself, just as a very busy working mom. I never have it together in time to put my vote in the mailbox and get it there on time, and so I know it'll get there. Most of the time these ballot drop boxes are in very secure locations, right? They're not just in the middle of nowhere. They're at City Hall or at the post office or at an elections office. These places usually have surveillance. There's usually, at least in the ones in Boise, there's a heavy police presence in downtown Boise, like where I've dropped mine off. It's another example of a solution in search of a problem. These things are safe, they're reliable, and there's been no cases of them being an issue, and it's just a way to make voting less accessible. So yeah, and it goes far beyond convenience, right? These things, ballot drop boxes are really important for some people, as Lauren mentioned. Some people don't feel comfortable for whatever reason having a post office worker handle it, or going in and having a county clerk touch their ballot or something like that. So yeah.
Also, shout out to the volunteer poll workers that testified in opposition to this bill. they described the security and oversight of those boxes. They talked about securing the key to the drop boxes. Again, just all the applause for the folks that came out to testify in opposition to these bills.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's such a great story to bring up. And that also is a reminder, right? We have folks as young as 16 who can volunteer to be poll workers. And when they do enter that space, they're able to share back those experiences, because that poll worker was questioned then by the committee, the House State Affairs Committee, on the process, asked to describe it. And they went step by step, every bit of information, and it was so awesome to hear how secure it was, right? They were never allowed to see them, never allowed to physically touch them. The communication and the route to and from the Dropbox had to be very streamlined, and there were no further questions once that was explained. There was no further call for investigation, right? And so I think one of the things that Idaho does very right in our elections is that we have these drop-off boxes for absentee ballots. And thank you. I think we're ready for the next question.
And our next question, going back to the same idea of security, there was a bill involving unaffiliated voter registration. So the deadline for unaffiliated voters to change their party registration at the same time was March 11th, was last month. And currently unaffiliated voters are only able to vote within their ballot in the primary elections. So with a little bit about this bill, do you believe that this necessary changes the security of Idaho elections? Also, hypothetically speaking, if this bill were to have made it, how would this have impacted upcoming primary elections? And Holly, I will start with you.
Oh yeah, I'll start on this one. So in Idaho, we have 310,000 unaffiliated voters. That's a lot of people. 310,000 people are unaffiliated. And
that's the second largest voting bloc in Idaho.
Right? That's a ton of people. And people choose to be unaffiliated for whatever reason. It might be that they don't know, they don't know which party best represents them. It might be that they have that independent Western spirit and don't want to affiliate with a party. Whatever reason it is, we have that many unaffiliated voters, and this would have forced those people to declare a party by March 11th, which is a huge mistake, right? And we had clerks or volunteer poll workers who came out and said, oh my gosh, I have a ton of people on primary election day who come and they request whichever ballot they'd like, right? And it's something that you can do right now if you're unaffiliated and you go to the polls and you say, I want the Dem ballot or I want the Republican ballot, and you can vote in that primary. This would have changed that. These people would have been turned away at the polls. And again, this was a House bill, so it had an emergency clause, so it would have gone into effect immediately upon signing had it gone into, had it become law. And in my head, I read this bill and I was envisioning 310 very angry people showing up to vote and being like, oh my gosh, what do you mean I can't vote in the primary? I've always voted in the primary. Why can't I vote now? And taking out that anger on our volunteer poll workers because this change happened right underneath their noses without them knowing about it. It has huge implications, and it really, would have cut all those people out of the process. So I'm happy this one died early.
Yeah, that bill is just really bad as a matter of policy because it would force unaffiliated voters to choose their affiliation prior to having all of the relevant information about the people that were running for office. And so there are, unaffiliated voters who wait to affiliate until they're able to research each of the candidates who have filed to run for office. And so House Bill 439 require voters to change their affiliation no later than the last day that candidates file to run for office. And so you're forcing folks to affiliate when at this point it's not even clear who is running because they're still waiting to the last minute to be able to meet the filing deadline. And so, you know, it was concerning because it doesn't give unaffiliated voters the requisite time to research the folks that they want to be voting for. I think, you know, the emergency clause was extremely problematic in that it, you know, they weren't going to be able to get the information out to Idahoans that they need to, that the deadline has changed and it could disenfranchise the second largest voting bloc in the state of Idaho. And, you know, it doesn't have really anything to do with election security or voting access. And so I think that that's important to note too. And so along the lines of Holly, I am glad to see that bill dead.
Thank you. I think we will now go on to the next question, passing it back to Antonio.
Thank you, Zephy. And we've already alluded to this quite a bit, right? This next question being, what were county clerks and election officials saying in response to these bills, but maybe making more space for all the discussion, like some of the comments that were made, right? We just talked about the unaffiliated voter registration bill. And I remember specifically one legislator saying that there was concern that voters might be gaming the system by waiting until they had all the information to then choose what party they wanted to affiliate with, and basically describing what I thought was just democracy in voting, right? That you would choose which candidates you wanted to vote for that best speak to your values. And right, we, like many legislative sessions, we hear a lot of different quotes, but also just the original question being like, what were county clerks and election officials saying in response to this bill? And I just like to open that up a little bit more, but happy to whichever part of that question you'd like to speak to, starting with Lauren.
I mean, I'm just like, preach, Antonio. I don't really have anything to add after that question. Absolutely, we should be, you know, I think that good governance requires us coming together to make sure that folks have access to exercise their right to vote and that folks feel empowered to be informed when they vote. And a lot of these bills really hit at the ideals, both of those ideals, and compromise both of those ideals in a way that is really hurtful to our democracy. Pass it over to you, Holly.
In terms of clerks, county clerks, and elections officials specifically, I got the sense that they felt very attacked, right? So a lot of this rhetoric especially after the 2020 election was, you know, we need to have people watching, we need to have people there, we need to investigate this, all this fraud is happening. And so in response to that, the Secretary of State actually conducted a study, and I think Lauren mentioned it earlier, you know, he did a study and found everything was in order, there was no fraud, there was no issues, like everything was accurate. And then still after that study, we still had all of these elections bills. And so I think clerks, they work really hard. You know, these are bureaucrats and they're volunteers, like they're volunteer poll workers. A lot of times they're retired people or young people. And they definitely felt, I got the sense that they were, felt targeted, right? As these, you know, places of fraud, and it's not true, right? And so their jobs were being questioned, and that's not a good thing when it's based on untruth. So it was good to see them show up and explain the process in a very level-headed, calm way and say, this is actually how it works. This is what happens. This is how we do things. you know, if you have questions, please come in and talk to me about it. Like, give me a call and I'll talk you through the whole process. And then also that we had clerks and poll workers and folks from all over the state who showed up, right? Like everybody from Kootenai County up north, all the way down to, I think, Owyhee County. So the whole range all over the state, these elections, folks showed up. So that was good.
Well, and I think like, right, we all like, we want election integrity. Like
We
we want
do.
election security. Like we want those things and we have those things. And so I think that it can sometimes be difficult because the narrative around these bills are like, oh, like we must do this. It's so important to protect election integrity, even at the expense of, you know, voting access. And that's why it was so powerful to have, you know, really the experts on these issues come and speak to, this is what's actually happening on the ground. We have, you know, secure elections. And, you know, they were really powerful and kind of reframing accurately, reframing the issue and you know, I think addressing concerns that legislators had and debunking some of the misconceptions.
Awesome, thank you. Zephy, would you like to ask the next question?
After we have talked about all these bills, sometimes in the madness of session, we usually kind of get confused of what ends up happening, what are the outcomes. So the big question is, did any of these bills pass? And of course, we have been talking about the majority of them not passing. So of course, we all kind of know the answer is no, but also I want to give this moment to allow us to just appreciate the small victories and something that you all appreciated and just out of your experience during session. So Holly, go ahead.
Yeah, I think they were big victories. We had, you know, there were well over 60 pieces of legislation that involved elections in some way. And that's not necessarily that unheard of, right? And the vast majority of those were, you know, changing one word or like making a technical correction. They were non-threatening. They were mostly came from the Secretary of State, not big changes, right? And that's the kind of thing that we need to do just to keep up the system and make sure that things are working correctly. But it was really a big victory to see legislation proposed both in the House and in the Senate that would have restricted the vote die. All of those bills died, every single one of them. And it's a huge victory. Especially in, you know, the Idaho legislative session can be kind of a downer. So definitely having wins like this is cause to celebrate. And then Lauren, what do you think?
Yes, celebrate. Yes, all the things. I feel like there were so many moments Holly and I were just like suffering through session. And I yeah, it was great to see the outcome on these bills, and I'm thrilled that they didn't move forward. And I'm excited for folks to be able to exercise their right to vote, the upcoming primaries, and for elections to be secure, and for folks to be able to access their right to vote.
So the next question, I'm also realizing we already touched on quite a bit. We're talking just about the impacts caused by the bills and the ability for new voters and young to exercise their right to vote. But there's a second part, which is, what are you hearing when it comes to students voting? And so I'd love to, you know, in that vein, right, like we are talking about certain bills, but more on the broader sense, what are the abilities for new and young voters to exercise their right to vote? And what are you hearing when these new and young voters start voting? But also, if you'd like to speak on the impacts of these bills in regards to that, that's totally valid, since that's the question. So I'll start with Lauren.
Ooh, I was gonna say I want to hear Holly's answer to this question, so I'm gonna kick it over to Holly.
I would think that kind of an ongoing goal of certain caucuses within the legislature would be to get rid of student IDs as a valid form of identification for voting. I mean, we saw legislation last year that did away with student IDs. We saw it this year. I would think that that is something that they're going to keep trying to do, right? To get rid of student IDs as a valid form of identification. And the reasoning behind that is that they don't have a date of birth, right? Student IDs don't usually have your date of birth on them. It just has, you know, your picture and where you go to school and what class you're in, or, you know, information like that. And so that will have an impact on young people. You know, that's going to be an ongoing thing. I'm guessing we'll see more legislation next year trying to do away with the similar things. So that absolutely has an impact. If we see legislation similar to this year proposed next year, it will disproportionately affect young people, right? You know, especially some of the things around proving residency, having to have a certain kind of proof of residency. Like, I think one of the lists this year included like a mortgage statement and a utility bill, things that a lot of young people don't have necessarily, you know. Or if you're young, I mean, when I was young, my name wasn't on the lease at my rental agreement. Like, one of the other 4 women I lived with was on the lease. And so these things they will absolutely impact young people. And that's very upsetting to me, because I think some of our younger voters are our most energized, right? And should have a large part and a large voice in the conversation, because that's our future. So we need our young people out there. We need them voting.
Any thoughts, Lauren?
I don't think really anything to add from what Holly said. I was just thinking about even with allowing student IDs, I was just thinking about my experience as a student and trying to exercise my right to vote. And I remember one particular day, it was like I was on the debate team, I had back-to-back classes, I worked a job on top of my classes, I had caretaking responsibilities, like all of these things, these barriers for me to be able, like it can be difficult to exercise my right to vote. And so, you know, I think for me, I'm always interested in hearing stories about ways that we can increase access for folks to meet them where they're at, so that they can exercise their right to vote, and that folks aren't, you know, disenfranchised because of their circumstances. And so, you know, listening to Holly, even know about how even just being able to use your student ID card can help alleviate some of those barriers, and being able to use that as a form of identification, but also like looking offensively at ways that we can decrease barriers for folks in our community, so that we can be sure that they can exercise their right to vote.
Excellent. I think we're on our last question. Zephy, would you like to lead this?
So as we are finishing up with session, and we have talked about all these bills that are pertaining to elections, I think a big question is, how would the bills affected voting in elections and in May? And do you believe that these bills are going to set precedent for possibly next session, or just how everyone's going to react in terms of the primary elections coming up in May? And I will start off with Lauren.
So thankfully, because none of the bills passed, we aren't seeing a shift in our regular, what you expect when you go to the polls. And so, you know, we're grateful for that. I mean, as we noted, with things with the emergency clause, there would be so little time to do the necessary, you know, public education and outreach, and provide folks with the information they need to be able to ensure that they can vote. And so grateful that we aren't scrambling to try to provide that public education to community. And, you know, I think as has been hinted at in this conversation, is that unfortunately we don't necessarily see these attacks on voter rights going away. We anticipate that there will be new bills to oppose come next legislative session. And so for me, I think it's just, again, highlighting the power of community, the power of poll workers' voices, the power of county clerks, the power of students coming in and speaking their truth about, how much they love their right to vote and how critical it is that we have access to the polls. And so again, just a big applause to the folks who engaged this legislative session so that we were able to defeat some really terrible bills. What you got, Holly?
I imagine that if, several of these bills, if they had passed, if House Bill 692 had passed, if Senate Bill 1375 had passed, it would have been chaos at the polls, right? Because we would have had all of these changes. We would have had to retrain poll workers, retrain clerks. The upcoming primary is a pivotal election. I mean, all elections are important. This one's like extra important. After we've gone through redistricting, this is a crucial election. So, making big changes like this would have been disastrous because we would not have been able to get information out to voters or poll workers or clerks. Elections officials would have been put in a terrible position. And it just would have been a bad deal. And so I'm very thankful that they were stopped. As far as, looking forward, we're probably going to see more of this next year. I think one of the really important things that any of you can do, if, out there in Facebook land listening, pay attention to the Secretary of State's race. That's an important one. The Secretary of State is our elections official. They're the top elections official. And so, look at the candidates, check them out and see, what's important to you, who holds your values, and make sure that, we get the right people to represent us. And that's, yes, that race, but all the races. So we work really hard to protect the right to vote, and we need to also make sure that we are exercising our right to vote, right? And that's primary election and general election and the school board election and like all of the little things that happen. So all of them, do as much as you can. Local elections affect us the most. So they have the biggest impact on our lives.
Thank you all so much. We do have questions in the chat, and I'm trying to get through these. Thank you all so much for adding your thoughts. Everyone says hi. Chanel Higgins, Claudia Swastegi, Sylvia, Larry Charrington, Joel Sweeney, Estella Zamora, and Sylvia, Larry Charrington. I might be repeating, but Joel has a question. So Joel's question is, how does one, or how could one try to push back against those that think there are problems with our current voting system? And adds, the bills not passing are great, but I'd love to get more or less everyone in our communities on the same page about whether there was a problem or not. Is the answer canvassing of some sort, news reports, testifying before committees? And I'll open this up to everyone, not just our panelists, but whoever wants to chime in first, please go on ahead.
I'll start because I get to ask this question a lot. Like, how do I engage? What's the best way to engage and impact policy? Have conversations. Have hard conversations with your family, with your neighbors, with your friends. If somebody, if you're at a barbecue and somebody pops off about election fraud, be like, you know what? I actually heard that wasn't true. Like, I heard that they did a study that, and they looked for it. They didn't find any. Bring the truth into the spotlight and have these hard conversations around your kitchen table, in the backyard barbecue. Talk about things, even if it feels awkward. Your voice matters too. So, and if it's not talked about, then it just gets slid under the rug, and then we have terrible bills that come up. So have those hard conversations in person or on the phone. Not necessarily the keyboard warrior style, but accountability is important too. So have those conversations.
I'd also like to just add, right, we don't know what we don't know. And that's kind of like a tired saying, but it's true. When I first started voting in Idaho, I didn't really know that much about our system. I didn't really know that much about all the ways in which people could vote. Like vote by mail, I didn't start voting by mail until 2020 or 2018, probably 2018. And right, so if I don't know about it, there are probably a lot of folks in my community that don't know about it. Just, expanding on what you were saying, Holly, and especially if folks, don't have English as their first language and don't know, right, if, oh, I missed election, I'm gonna miss election day, I guess I can't vote. It's like, no, you can vote early. You can vote, there's a 2-week period where you can vote. And if you're in Boise, sometimes there's a traveling mobile location where you can go to vote, and all those options being available, right? Spreading that message and spreading those resources so that folks know that they don't have to just vote on election day in person if they're not able to.
Yeah, I'll also add, tough conversations, absolutely. You can submit letters to the editor, op-eds, to your local paper. I think that can be really impactful and have broad scope. And absolutely always welcome additional testimony in opposition to these bills. And so, ACLU has a bill tracker for bills that we're following on voting rights. I know that CVI also does incredible legislative updates about the bills they're tracking. And so plugging into orgs that are working on this issue to follow along during the legislative session is another great way to be involved.
I'll also say that in Idaho, we enjoy really accessible elected officials, right? If you contact folks, most of the time, you're going to get a response. And that's especially true outside of the legislative session, right? And so especially for some of these folks who are running for office, call them up, like be respectful about it. But send them an email, call them up, show up to their town halls and ask questions. And again, be respectful, but ask them questions like, how do you feel about restricting the right to vote? Like, what do you feel about ballot drop boxes? And get an answer from them. So.
I think another thing to add on to what everyone else is saying, and I think as well as just knowing that your experience as a voter definitely does make an impact, and just speaking on your experience alone can make a lot of these bills and sometimes even just completely be diminished, in the sense of these are what the voters are talking about. We're creating these bills for the people, and you are the people, you're the voters, therefore it's affecting you directly. And working with organizations, or just having those conversations just sometimes of, this is what I've experienced as a voter and this is how I've been impacted. And of course there's some that aren't going to be as opposed to it, but your experience alone does make an impact as well.
Yeah, I think Zephy, that's a really great point, because right, stories about voting aren't really shared. Something that I think that's a fault in our culture around our democracy is we don't celebrate it maybe enough and uplift like the stories of our voting experiences, and it can feel very like isolating, right? It's supposed to be, we have a culture on it being like very private, right? You have a secret ballot, and I think all of those things are valid, but how do we also tell the stories so that folks know how essential these other ways for folks to vote are, and instead of like allowing people to drive the narrative, oh, the only story is that voter fraud exists, the only story is that these are unsafe, and instead share the personal stories about voting. We have another question, and it's from Gretchen Wisner. Thank you so much for your question. It's so it's around primaries, right? We have closed primaries for some and open for others. And Gretchen's question is, she's assuming that unaffiliated voters could vote for the Democratic ballot without registering for a party. Is this correct? So basically, right, like, are unaffiliated voters able to just vote for the Democratic ballot without declaring a party, as opposed to just Republicans that have the closed primary?
I can answer this one. So it's a little confusing, right? So we have the primary election, and then whoever wins in the primary election, be it the primary election is where we decide who's going to be the party person, right? And so you might have 3 Republicans in the primary race and 1 Democrat. And so the Republicans have a closed primary, the Democrats have an open primary. So if you are an unaffiliated voter, you can choose which primary ballot you would like on election day. The Republicans are closed, so you have to declare yourself a Republican. I'm a member of the Republican Party in order to vote in their primary and choose which candidate you want to advance onto the general election. If you would like to vote in the Democratic primary or the Constitution Party or the Libertarian primary, you can do that without being affiliated with that particular party. Once we get to the general election, you can vote for whoever you want to, and it doesn't matter what party affiliation you have. So you can be a Republican and vote for a Dem, or vice versa, or however you want. You can go back and forth on the ticket, like whatever works for you. So there is some confusion there because the Republican Party is the only primary that is a closed primary in the state. And that's only been the case for, I want to say like 10 years, maybe not even that long.
I think that does it for our questions. We're getting a lot of kudos in the chat, right? Folks saying that these are huge victories, thanking for the help and sharing the information. Thanks all so much for watching. We absolutely appreciate that this was helpful. You know, and please follow up with us. So the organizations here today, Conservation Voters for Idaho and ACLU of Idaho, are just 2 partners that work on this, but there are so many other organizations out there that make this possible. Just a quick shout out: League of Women Voters of Idaho, AAUW of Idaho, Babe Votes, Idaho Access Project. You know, I'm probably missing so many because there are so many people that make this work possible. And
Ooh, shout out to Link Disability Rights Idaho
Link.
as well.
Yes, yeah. Big shout out
and
to
Idaho
Link.
Women in Action.
Idaho Women in Action, right? The way I see this work, right, I have one perspective, which is my own, on how this may impact folks, and I lean on others to share their perspective on how this could possibly affect others, and that's how we really start to make sure that we're inclusive and we see all the intersections on how this work and how I can do better, how we can do better, and how these bills would affect us. And so big shout out to all of you. And we hope that there's a lot to take away from this, and that you're able to share this with maybe friends and family and neighbors, and maybe even some elected officials. Right? Just or folks who are interested in running for office or interested in supporting voting rights here in Idaho. Any,
And while we're doing thank yous, just wanted to voice and give appreciation to you, Antonio and Zephy. Thank you so much for all your work planning and doing the logistical stuff to make this event possible. So thank you. Big love to y'all.
Yep, echo that for doing all of the on the ground stuff and all of the work. It takes lots of people to make this work happen. So thanks. And thank you to everybody in Facebook land.
excellent. Well, with that, we'll bid farewell. Thank you all again so much.